Yes, indeedy, my friends. It's time for the hot seat. Reasons hot seat. Who have we got in that hot seat tonight? Well, it's none other than a businessman, someone who was the former deputy chairman, some might say the best, of Reform UK, and a man who actually, I would argue, gives a lot of us a hope and actually enables the rest of us to not feel like we're going crazy because he is such a beacon of common sense. He's incredibly outspoken, but I mean that as a compliment, not in a negative way. He's outspoken in a way in which the BBC wouldn't like, shall we say. But here at Reasoned UK, we very much do like it, my friends. Yes, indeed, I'm joined by the one and only Ben Habib. Ben, thank you very much for giving up your time to be with me this evening.
Not at all. Thank you, Darren. And what a gorgeous intro. I mean, I'll pay you afterwards.
Absolutely. Now, Ben, because we're not on the beautiful platform that is GB News, we can say whatever the hell we want, and I don't have to provide balance or be regulated by Ofcom. Isn't that marvellous? But Ben, I want to actually ask you about what you got up to yesterday. Now, before anyone asks, I haven't been sneaking through your diary. I saw that you were at the farming protest yesterday. I mean, first of all, Ben, I have to ask you about the size of it. Sly News said that there were only hundreds there. I mean, is that your interpretation of the size of the protest?
I couldn't see the entire crowd because, it's a peculiar thing. When you go to Whitehall, somehow the police always manage to constrain the crowd. I don't know whether you felt that, but
Yeah.
I just couldn't move around very easily. I would guess there was somewhere between 10 and 12, 13,000 people there, just looking at the crowd myself. It was certainly a hell of a lot more than hundreds. I couldn't move,
Mm,
for lack of space. So, no, it was definitely crowded. But I wish the police wouldn't put barricades up every
I know.
single place, so you could just mingle a bit more easily.
Well, they don't do that though for certain protests, though, Ben. Right? If the Palestinian protesters are out and about, they don't feel the need to kettle them in like they did yesterday or like they do at other rallies. I mean, for example, they said that they had reported tractors who had gone beyond the barriers of which you speak. My argument was, well, I tell you what, maybe the tractors ought to have flown Palestinian flags and shouted obscenities about Jews, and then maybe the police would have turned a blind eye.
Yeah, probably, probably.
Right,
But I mean,
Ben.
it was a kind of quintessentially British day, funny enough, I thought yesterday. People turning up in their wellies, their barbers, their shooting jackets, caps on. The weather suited precisely the day. It was a miserable, cold sort of day that you might expect in the country at a 5 a.m. wake up call to go and milk the cows or,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. And the pavements were also covered in muck. I don't know how that happened, but it really felt like you were in the country in Whitehall yesterday,
Which
and
is no
and
easy
everyone
feat.
was well,
Which is
no
no
easy
small
feat, but
feat, is it?
everyone was polite, kind. There was no far right that I could see. I tried to find the
No.
far right. I looked in the mirror a few times, but I discounted that image. No, it was just a great little get together, I think, and the message I hope got through. It did make the front page of the FT today, which I was pleased to see.
Yes, I mean that on that point then you describe it as being a quintessentially British protest, right? You know, farmers out in their wellies bringing the countryside to the beating heart of British power. You know, Whitehall with more diversity and inclusion managers dotted around the place than anywhere else per head of population. But I wonder if you have any agreement with what these farmers had to say on ITV yesterday.
Instead, we can bring our tractors out on the motorway.
This is the final straw. The simple matter of the fact is that farming is not profitable enough to pay the family farm tax.
The government doesn't feel like it's backing down. Do you think farmers are going to back down?
We won't back down on this.
Close it down if that's what it takes.
And would you consider that if the government doesn't listen?
Sure we would.
We could bring it down because we could stop taking all the cattle to market.
We don't
could
want to
bring
do
it
that.
down.
We don't want to do that at all.
This will mean farms up and down the country have to close.
Farmers will be driven off the land.
Because the farmers' kids work all their life for a pittance just to expect to have the farm at the end of the day, and now farmers trying to take it away.
The government just simply showed it doesn't understand how food is produced in the countryside.
Labour governments have been screwing us for years.
There's no farmers, there's no food.
There's thousands of farmers here today. Do you think you can sum up how farmers feel?
Gutted, just almost depressed, you know, the fact that people are losing family members because of what's going on.
Just betrayed, I think is the only word for it. Betrayed by the government.
Rejected by the government.
What do you say to Labour ministers who say most farmers aren't going to be hit by these changes?
I don't want to say anything too rude on telly, but absolute codswallop.
I mean, Ben, the man that got me was this man here, when you could hear his voice break and say, you know, all that we want to do is hand over our farms to our next generation. That inheritance that Labour finds so uniquely evil, you know, the idea of inherited so-called wealth, which isn't wealth, because as you well know, you know, having a multi-million-pound farm doesn't make you a multi-millionaire, right? Because the land itself might be worth that, but actually the work upon it ain't worth that. And actually you can find in places like Cumbria making minimum wage despite having all this land. So would you argue that actually it needs to go beyond being quintessentially British, and actually there needs to be more action like you saw in France, like you saw in Netherlands, where governments were brought to a standstill, and actually there was wider action than what you saw yesterday?
So, I mean, I'd just like to say a couple of things before I get to that, if I may, Darren. And it's this, that farms, you know, this is all in the headlines now because of the inheritance tax changes and bringing them into the inheritance tax net, which will force the breakup of small to medium-sized British farms. And farms have been in the crosshairs of bad government policy for decades. And it starts, as I say, decades ago, when planning policy enabled large supermarkets to develop right across the country at the expense of small shops. And what the large supermarkets did was use the buying power that they have to absolutely screw down farmers on the profit margins that farmers could make. Because if you want to sell to Tesco or Sainsbury and you want the consumer to get the best possible deal, the farmers took the brunt of the pain of that, and their standard of living reduced. Then they had obviously the entire net zero, the burden of the net zero agenda on them, which increases their fertilizer costs, which increases their the cost of their fuel, the cost of harvesting, and so on and so forth. And then on top of that, as you say, minimum wage, actually, you know, they do employ some people on very low wages. Whenever a regulatory burden falls on the employed, that obviously affects farmers. So if they're employing anyone on minimum wage, well, that's just been put up. Employers' national insurance has just been put up. The whole burden of bad government policy for many, many years is falling on farmers. And while I'm just discussing that, I will say that it's not farmers alone who have, you know, been in the crosshairs of this. Small and medium-sized businesses right across the United Kingdom have been hit with the same lack of joined-up thinking. And it is a tough job being a farmer. People don't decide one morning they're going to leave the city of London, give up their massive, well-paid city job, and go and work on a farm. These are generations of people who've done it because they love the land, because it's in their blood. And if we break that patrician form of farming that we have in this country, people who actually enjoy getting up at 5 a.m. in the freezing cold to do what they have to do so that we've got eggs, bread and milk and everything else on our breakfast tables. If we want that to continue, we've got to wake up and understand that actually we've got to take the pressure off our farming industry. One other thing I didn't mention was, of course, this unabated free trade that we've had, the so-called brilliant free trade we've had with the European Union until we left, you know, which also put a huge burden on our farmers, because instead of being able to grow domestic product seasonally as they would wish to do, they had to obey all the CAP rules, the Common Agricultural Policy, and we had to import all sorts of nonsense from Europe, which is, you know, when instead we should be doing it domestically. And what our government needs to do, really critically, is to support our critical food supplies. And if they really care about the planet, they wouldn't go thousands of miles to import this food. They would grow it locally, and they wouldn't be giving farms over now to solar panels and to wind farms and all that kind of garbage. And they're also going to, by the way, now start putting houses on our farms and our green areas, because there's far too much immigration. They can't cope with the with the speed at which houses need to be built, and also net zero again, because if you repurpose town centres to create residential units, the net zero burden on those existing units is too high. So they go to the green fields where it's easier for them to do it. The farming industry and rural United Kingdom is being pressured in every direction. And so it's not just the inheritance tax, it's all the things that I've mentioned and probably other stuff that I've forgotten to mention that's come to, pressure them.
The point that the farmers were raising there earlier, how do we get the government to actually
Yeah.
notice British farming? Because, they've tried going through the democratic means, right? They certainly didn't have a chance at the ballot box because of the fact that it was never actually, they were never told that this was going to be put into policy. They did it subsequently in the first budget of this government. How can people actually make their feelings clear on this? Because I would argue that the vast, vast majority of Britain are on the side of the farmers.
Absolutely. And small, medium-sized businesses and businesses that are inherent for our national security. We all get it. It's just the government doesn't seem to get it. And I think you're right. This government may have a 175-seat majority, whatever it is, but they only got 9.7 million votes, down 600,000, 700,000 from what they got in 2019 when they took a drubbing. They do not have the popular support of the country. And I think it is time, that the Brits took perhaps a note, from the French and get their tractors out on the streets and dump manure all over the place and make the point. Like Extinction Rebellion, when they bring central London to a complete halt and they've got policemen dancing with them and cajoling with them, making jokes, standing around while they lie in the middle of roads and make commuters' lives difficult. Let's give them a bit of that treatment. Let's block the roads. Let's stop the United Kingdom from working. Let's send the message home to Parliament. If they won't listen to reasonable arguments, then you have to become, I'm afraid, unreasonable.
Yeah, well said, well said. I mean, what would you argue then to those who say, well, people like you and I have argued against the aims and objectives of the likes of Just Stop Oil, who glue their arses to the road and all the rest of it. If farmers do the same, are we hypocrites?
I wouldn't, certainly not. I wouldn't advocate, by the way, the destruction of any of our fine art and our national treasures. And I wouldn't advocate any farmers glue their bottoms to the road. I think that's just an absurdity. But there's no comparison between Just Stop Oil, which is part of the same ideological ridiculousness that has got the farmers into the problems in which they're in. The farmers need to be heard. Look, it is fundamental. It's like I think the lady said, no farms, no food. Get it through your heads. And if the European Union wishes to cut up rough, and let's say we have a trade war, Trump imposes tariffs on Europe, we end up on the Anglo-Saxon side of that trade war with Europe. We will be ever more dependent on our farms for our food, and they won't be able to produce it because of years of bad policy. We won't be able to respond to the nation's demands. It needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, I mean, Jeremy Clarkson yesterday, when he was on stage, he delivered this brilliant speech, despite the fact he was quite unwell. And Clarkson was talking about how the fertilizer, for example, under environmental rules, has a tax applied to it, and it makes it more expensive. The burden is greater for especially small farms, but all farmers across the piece. This is all part of the net zero story, right?
It is.
I'm wondering, Ben, to what extent do you think the British public will wake up to just how perilous a position net zero places not just farms, but the entire economy in? Because we also saw today, or heard today, that the rate of inflation has gone up past what the Bank of England predicted it would be. And they put that down to, guess what, Ben? Well, energy. Who could have guessed it?
Energy costs.
And I just wonder, what will it take? We're waking up to the plight of farmers. Will we also wake up to the regulatory noose that has been tied around the neck of the British economy?
So one of the challenges we've got, those of us who wish to communicate the dangers in which we're putting ourselves with this net zero policy, one of the challenges we've got is that somehow people have equated the drive to net zero with saving the planet, And whether or not you believe that man-made climate change is a thing, or whether or not you believe that man-made climate change is going to lead to the planet burning up, is a matter of religion now. You can't even have that debate. And somehow we need to step away from the religion and look at the policy and recognize that the policy is delivering the United Kingdom, which, by the way, produces less than 1% of global carbon emissions, is one of the cleanest countries on the planet, delivering the United Kingdom into manifold problems as it heads towards 2050. And those problems are going to hit us much earlier than 2050. It's the stepping stones that are so damaging. And the other challenge we've got is drawing together all the multiple impacts of net zero. It's not just that your fuel at the petrol pump is going to go up, or the fuel in your gas boiler is going to go up. It's going to increase the cost of industry. It's going to make our security it'll make our defenses less secure because we won't have steel to build ships with. It will make our farming more challenging because of the cost of fertilizers and obviously the cost of fuel. It makes everything more expensive. And when everything becomes more expensive, interest rates go up. So borrowing costs go up. So you have less money in your back pocket if you borrowed against your farm or against your business or against your home. And so on and so forth. And you produce less profit. The government continues to be hungry for the need for cash. It goes on raising taxes, and you end up in a doom loop. Expensive energy leads to multiple bad outcomes for the entire United Kingdom and, of course, for the farming sector amongst it. And it's drawing together all those dots, which is challenging for political commentators because, you need a bit of time on a program like this to elucidate it. And, we just got to keep banging that drum and hope that the penny drops.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously agree with that, and very well said. But I wonder to what extent the media class get that, and whether or not there isn't more of a need for independent media such as this, because the likes of James O'Brien tried his sneering old condescension, and he was given very short shrift. And I think you might approve of this. I think it'll have the Habib stamp of approval. But have a little listen. I'll just play a short part of what was said on his show on LBC yesterday.
Stop talking over me and let someone who actually knows speak for once. And I know that's difficult for you, James.
Why are you so rude, Charlie? It's not my fault. It's not my fault.
You've just made. You are the rudest person on the radio because you sit there with your foot in your knob.
I'm the second rudest person on the radio at the moment. At this moment, Charlie.
When a farmer inherits his farm and he can't afford to pay that inheritance tax because it's hundreds of thousands of pounds and he only makes £30,000 a year.
Well, can we crunch the numbers quickly?
That's his home, James.
Can we crunch the numbers quickly?
Yeah, by all means.
So hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of tax, presuming, of course, that it's passed from spouse to spouse and then to heir. So it's in excess of £3 million. So for hundreds of thousands of pounds at a 20% tariff, regardless of what the figure is, the percentage is 20%. You'd have to be living in an estate worth sort of £6, £7, or £8 million.
No, 4.5 million, James.
No, hundreds of thousands of pounds. You said.
4.5, yeah, exactly.
So that's 1.5 million, 20% of 1.5 million over 10 years.
Yeah, and how are you going to pay that?
40% for everybody else.
How are you going to pay that when you earn 25 grand a year?
The same. Well, I don't. How can you possibly be argued, Charlie? Charlie,
my house is protected. When a farmer inherits his farm, his house is at risk.
Why don't you sell some stuff?
Like what, James?
Well, some of your land.
Who's going to buy it? Who's going to buy it?
I don't know. Lots of people are trying to buy land.
We spoke to. That's the funny thing.
What do you want a name?
Farmer's not going to buy it,
John.
are they? John's
going to buy it. John is going to buy it.
John's going to build solar panels on it.
John. I don't know what he's going to do with it, but he's going to. But you asked me who was going to buy it, which you don't recognise. You're shouting at me again.
We've had the offers for wind farms.
Well, there you go. Then what are you complaining about?
Because we don't want to concrete over the land. I know you're a townie. I know you're happy living in your liberal elite world of London. But for us, the countryside is the countryside. It's where our food comes from, James.
So you've been offered.
You seem to have forgotten that.
You
seem to have forgotten that, haven't you, James?
Charlie, you
can't
don't.
accept it.
Okay, mate. I'm going to have a
I'm
little.
not your mate. I hate you. I think you're an idiot.
Okay.
I think you're a lefty, liberal, woke idiot.
Okay, Charlie.
I mean, you get a flavour there of how that conversation goes, Ben. But the fact of the matter is that there is this sneering condescension, right? They all support, despite the fact they come from relatively privileged homes themselves, potentially more privileged than your average farmer, and they argue against private schools, right? They support the taxation of that. They support this taxation on farms, which will lead to the sale of these, because they view farms as these wealthy landowners like James Dyson or Jeremy Clarkson. And they support the net zero agenda, wider taxation, all of these things. It's a Marxist hoo-ha, right? They love it. They gobble this stuff up in their privileged homes around their dining tables and talk about how marvellous and progressive they are. And there needs to be alternatives to these things, because that's exactly how the BBC thinks. That's why they were sneering at Jeremy Clarkson yesterday. It's how LBC with James O'Brien thinks. There needs to be other outlets for people not to be talked at like that. And I think it was marvellous to watch him being given both barrels back for a change.
Absolutely. I mean, James O'Brien is an idiot. He simply doesn't. He really simply is an idiot, because if he likens having to pay death duties on a farm to the same as having to pay death duties on a 5-bedroom house in London, he just hasn't grasped what's at stake here. A farm produces food. It's a very low profit business. Not many people want to go into farming. It's bloody demanding.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't want to be a farmer. I couldn't put up with the physical rigor and not knowing that I would always be living hand to mouth. It's a love of labor, if you like. It's a vocation. It's also highly skilled.
Yeah.
It requires the patrician approach for skills to go down from a father to son to daughter, whatever. And he likened it flippantly to, well, just sell some land. Oh yeah, you can sell it to solar panel. Yeah, well, what about when we don't have chickens and we don't have cows and we don't have arable land, and we've got solar panels everywhere, but we're reliant on China for our food supplies? It's unlikely. But you know what I'm saying? He just hasn't thought it through. And it's a absolutely proven fact, though the lefties may deny it, that businesses that are family owned and go through the generations do a lot better because of the patrician nature of ownership. And the other thing I will just mention as an aside, I used to have a fantastic book. This is not an argument that I would make across the board, but I used to have a fantastic book of stately homes that were knocked down in the 20th century, knocked down because families couldn't afford the inheritance tax on them. It was cheaper for them to destroy their stately homes. And the destruction, literal destruction, that resulted from inheritance tax for this country is something that we should be utterly ashamed of. And to justify it the way James O'Brien did is basically, it is lunatic. It is lunatic. And he can't, either he doesn't understand what's at stake, or he is anti-British and couldn't care less about the nation state. It's one of those two things.
Absolutely.
Or probably both.
Well, yes, indeed.